Okay, welcome to Vampires in the Academy. So today we're going to talk about using the vampire in the classroom, also publishing the vampire and the ways in which we can publish. Hopefully we can get some like little tips, which publishers are the most friendly to vampires. We're also, since we're all published at different varying levels, if you have some research questions you're struggling with or sources, that's pretty much what our intent is today. And then I guess if we have time at the end, we would like to kind of make it our business meeting, thinking about things that we can do next year, bearing in mind most people are going to do the papers they're going to do this year, next year. So. All right, so who would like to start?
Who are you?
Oh,
we have like at least a couple of new people.
Oh, that's right. Yes. So let's go around really quickly. So my screen is split up from Amanda down to KP. So Amanda, if you want to start, tell us something about yourself. If you use vampires in the classroom, that just needs to be yes or no. And then, yeah, something about yourself and vampires.
Oh, okay. So Amanda Hubson. Hi, everyone. I do use vampires in the classroom, but I also am an administrator, and I use them outside the classroom as well to teach social justice in programmatic formats on campus. And myself and vampires, I have been doing this since I was 10, I feel like. So got 30 years in. It's cool rocking that.
So I'm you, Melissa Aniwa. The Uzumaki is my legal name, but no one can pronounce it or spell it, so I don't use it. I am an African Americanist. I actually run our Black Studies department, and I started using vampires because I always teach at predominantly white colleges, and so it was really difficult to talk about race without excluding somebody, and so vampires kind of became a perfect image. Now, I think things have changed, and now I regularly teach a vampire class, but I also use elements of the vampire in all of my other classes too. It's Lisa next.
Hi, I'm Lisa Navarez. So British Romanticist and Latinx scholar, but vampires are what has always beckoned me. I've just always loved vampire literature, and it feels like it's in the past 10 years I've been able to say, okay, this is going to be my primary area of research, and I had support to do it. I love teaching the vampire. And I think the vampire opens up all kinds of fascinating ideas and conversations. So I'm really excited to hear what people have to say.
That takes us to Kate. Oh.
Hey, I'm Kate. I am a rare books librarian. In the past, I have taught first-year seminars using the vampire in literature and media. Right now, what I kind of do the most is I kind of spin what I do as the history of women in publishing. And, I'm like, well, isn't it just coincidental that there's a lot of genre and vampire stuff in women in publishing? Isn't that odd? Interesting, strange. Let me talk to you about it. That's how I roll. And I'm doing math now, and I've probably done this like 12 years now. Holy cow.
Thank you. That brings us to Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I am in my first year of my PhD journey. The first time I realized you could actually run with vampires as like a viable topic was in my first year of undergrad, and I took a course on Gothic writing. And then went, oh wow, like my interest can actually be an academic interest. So I kind of stuck with vampires throughout my master's. And now I'm looking at female monstrosity and feminism in the paranormal romance.
Excellent.
Dorothy, so I can unmute you. Hang on.
Hi, I'm Dorothy. I'm a first-year PhD student. So I haven't had the opportunity to teach vampires yet because I've only been permitted to teach courses that are composition focused thus far, which is probably a pretty familiar story to a lot of you. I did my master's in fan studies and fan fiction production specifically. That's what my thesis was on. But that sort of led me back down the rabbit hole, back to my very first fandom from 20 some years ago. And if you're doing math, yes, I have had a non-traditional path of study. I'm also a podcaster, and I talk about vampires pretty regularly on my podcast. So,
oh, thank you. Dorothy meet Kate. Kate meet Dorothy. Now we're down to the England family. I know, I just like saying the England family because, I'm being British. I got you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Nancy Rosenberg, England. I'm a Victorianist. My master's was in the early female Gothic novel, and specifically Zafloya. If you've read Zafloya.
Oh
Yeah, it's something.
Zafloya.
And then my dissertation was on Dracula film. And so I've taught mainly if I have a intro to sophomore lit, I always incorporate Dracula, of course, which I love to teach. And then I've taught vampire film course as well, and I like to incorporate gender studies, feminism, masculinity, things like that into the coursework.
Thank you. Kristen.
Hi, I'm an international best-selling author, and I have 4 published vampire novels. I'm a PhD student at Queen's University Belfast in Northern Ireland, and my master's degree was under Sam George's Open Graves, Open Mind Vampire Master's Program in England, and I worked on Anne Rice for my master's dissertation.
Actually, I'm thinking of taking that program. We should talk. We'll talk offline. But, I'm going to go to KP and I'll come back to you back. So Kendra.
Hi, so I'll have my camera on for the introduction. I'm Kendra Parker. I teach at Georgia Southern University, and I do teach on Black vampires specifically. I've got a book published on it, and I figured I would just join in to listen and chit chat.
Thank you.
So, yeah, no problem.
Hi, Becky. We're just introducing ourselves.
I'm a carpetbagger in this group. I am a criminal justice professor, and I have a PhD in political science, so I'm like a double carpetbagger. And I am currently writing my first vampire novel, and I love all things vampire. And Melissa, who brought me into the group, because she's amazing. I love Melissa.
All right, well, welcome. So I guess our first question on the table, our first question on the table would be, let's start with the scholarship first. So for those of you that are new, what we usually do at the PCA is we have a roundtable each year and we try and generate a new book, or we celebrate a book that came out. So the book that we're celebrating this year is this one by Kate. And one of the things that was so important about this book was I was exactly like most people. I'd focused entirely on the Western image of the vampire. And even when I didn't, I was, right? So even if I did something that was from Asia, or I still made it about America, really, even more about British. So I think that this book is so important because it really does allow us to recognize how much of our Western privilege that we have and how much of the story was being ignored. So thank you, Kate. I'm really curious to know how many of those of you that have been here before, that have published, how easy it was to convince a publisher, whether or not there was pushback. I think I'm going to aim it at Lisa first, because you had the first book that we did, which was the Teaching the Vampire Classroom. Mm-hmm. So how easy or difficult was it to convince the publisher that vampires were worth, both particularly vampires in the classroom, was something that would be worth publishing?
So I marketed it to a few different presses. Which one? One of them was interested, but just short. They didn't really want to do it. McFarland, though, has the teaching series. So that seemed to be a very natural fit because they had the teaching Buffy in the classroom, and the book's been out a few years now, and I don't remember. There was another volume on another topic. But so McFarland was great to work with in that regard. Just a great editorial team. Book PCA a lot. So I think that was a natural fit for that kind of volume. But I do know that for a pedagogy volume, some other presses kind of shied away from it. They're like, that's not quite what we want to do. Why do a pedagogy book? But McFarland was very open to that. And I know others of us have published with McFarland as well. Looking at you, Kate, and others.
Oh yeah, that's right. I think McFarland and Blackwell are probably the most open to the vampire image generally. I thought it's probably because they both focus so much on pop culture.
Yeah.
And your book was a really good example of what happens here. For those of you who haven't been to PCA yet, is that almost every chapter on the book was somebody who'd been at the PCA. So same thing with all of our books. Almost every single person we then tap was somebody whose paper we saw or somebody we talked to. And so we knew that they would then be really helpful in building our narrative over our global narrative. So that's why I think the PCA is kind of my favorite place for developing a vampire community. So we have been working with this it was a small publisher, Sense Publishers, out of, where the hell are they? Sweden?
The Netherlands?
Netherlands, that's it, yes. And they have a bunch of little series that have gotten bigger and bigger. One is teaching gender. There you go. One is teaching with race. So the black one is a teaching with race. And then the other two are gender. And the gender ones were both bestsellers. So, and then Sense got bought out by a bigger company, Brill, and Brill now has a much bigger imprint. But the best thing about Sense and Brill, for those of you who are thinking about it, they have a really great payment structure. You get probably more for your book than any other publisher I've heard. It's like 9 to 13%. And then all of their books are priced at $25 or $40. All of their books are 200 pages. So it's really simple. And then the one thing that we learned that we now do for all our books is their intent, which I think is so true of today. The books are not written for us, the books are written for our students. So they have to be accessible to a student audience, which doesn't mean to dumb it down. It just means to think about the fact that most students reading a chapter are tabula rasa. So making sure that they understand it. And then also including a bibliography chapter at the end. Thank heavens we all know Kate. And then a teaching chapter. So a chapter about the ways you can actually use it in the classroom. And that's now my favorite thing in all of the books is no matter what you want to use the book for, you can go to the back, find really great activities and questions and that kind of thing. So Sense and Brill are whatever you want to do. And they're particularly Patricia Levy, who runs the 2 series and a bunch of other ones, is really into arts-based research. So she really likes those of you that do things that are, what's the word I'm looking for, Amanda? Multimedia, multimodal?
Interdisciplinary and multimedia.
She loves. So if you want to include poetry, short story, regular scholarship, then they are a really great place to get your work out there. So I'll stick a link to them on the site. So our next book with them is going to be Queering the Vampire. Would you like to say some more about the super cool idea, Amanda?
So this is one of the areas that I've been working on a lot lately for the past few years. And one of the things that I want us to do with this text is to make it a multimedia approach. So have some scholarship, but also work with some of the folks writing queer vampire fiction, doing queer vampire related blogs, that kind of thing, and invite sort of not people who don't see themselves as scholars into the process. I think that's really important part. It's not, because for me, it's not just about this is accessible to our students, it's accessible to everyone. I see myself as a public scholar, and I think a lot of us do. And one of the pieces I wrote earlier in my career, my mom was like, it took me 4 days to read it. And then she read the piece that I wrote for the Race and the Vampire book. And she was like, it was so good. I loved every word. And I understood it. And it made me really realize. And then she shared it with my aunts. And like the book has now been passed around, which is extra weird, especially if you knew my family. It's really strange. But that's one of the things we wanted to make sure that we were connecting with, not just how do we connect with our students, but especially on a topic like queering the vampire, that we're making it accessible and open. So we do, that's the goal, that's what we're looking at. So we will be putting out a call for papers very soon, or call for chapters very soon for from folks like y'all, but also reaching out to some bloggers and some authors and things like that to see if they would like to join us in that venture.
Any idea of a timeline on that?
Yeah, Melissa and I are working on it right now. We should be working with Brill Sense pretty soon to get that contract, and then putting out that CFP, we're hoping this summer.
And then we're hoping it's given everything's happened, we were hoping it would be out for the next PCA. So that would be the roundtable, but we'll see what happens. I mean, what else are we doing, right?
Working 14 hours a day, but that's a whole nother.
Yeah, 24 hours a day. Kristen will tell you, you can bang out 19 novels. So Dave and Anthony, hi Billy. Oh,
hi.
Would you like to introduce yourself? We did a little introduction, who we are, what our interest is in vampires.
Sure. Hi, I'm Billy Tringali. I am the law librarian for outreach at Emory University School of Law, the Macmillan Law Library. I've been presenting here at the PCA Vampire Studies area since I was an undergrad. I'm specifically interested in queerness in the vampire and how specifically gay men are portrayed through the vampire, and queerness in and of itself. And lately I've been developing, probably because of the whole librarian information science background, how vampires are presented in games and gaming.
That was a great panel last year. Thank you.
It was very good. It was very fun. So
I'm wondering what your biggest challenges are as PhD students. One of the things that I hear a lot, and actually not to pick on you, Amanda, but that's also something that you've talked about too, is the difficulty in persuading PhD committees to accept you using the vampire as your image. And I can see how things are just changing, just from hearing Dorothy and Hannah, your introductions, that I can't possibly have imagined doing the vampire 100 years ago when I was doing my PhD, unless maybe I was in Victorian studies or Gothic studies. So it's really great now that things are changing. However, I'm still hearing the stories of people just not accepting that the vampire is something worthy of study. So, man, you're nodding vigorously.
Well, so some people on the call, or on the Zoom, already know my journey. So I actually officially started my PhD in 2012, proposing that I was doing vampires. And as I was attempting to defend my original proposal, was told that the only vampires I could do, I film studies is my background, the only vampires I could do in my program was anything that happened before 1900. Oh no, sorry, 1850. Sorry, which is problematic when you're a film scholar. Just putting that out there.
A little bit, just a little difficult to do.
A little difficult.
Oh, Amanda.
So I had to completely change direction for my dissertation in the middle of proposing my dissertation. So short story long, I have yet to finish my dissertation. I'm close. I should be defending this summer, but not on vampires, which is what I have written more than 700 words in the last 8 years, or 700 pages on in the last 8 years. So I mean, that's been my struggle, and that was the second program in which I had to change. It was the same for a master's program that I did. I got to thesis stage. That's where we had been working, and was told that I could not do vampires. That was pop culture. It wasn't real history. That was a history program. So that's been my experience. But weirdly, in my day job, I am a dean of students, and they support 100% me working on vampires and presenting vampires. So it's pretty funny.
That's right. Dorothy?
I think for me, a lot of it has to do with the way I have tended to frame my interest in not just vampires, but horror in general, around questions of queerness, representation, reception. And I tend to tie it very much into the fact that I'm also a pop culture and a fan fiction scholar. So because everything I do is framed as so modern and cutting edge, I ended up in a department that was friendly to that to start with. And it's not a surprise to them that I'm doing genre work.
I'm wondering if
Right.
the fanfic part of it is the bit that worked for them.
I suspect that had a lot to do with it, because it immediately sort of changed the tone that it landed in, as not a literature thing, even though it is literature. And if they read my thesis, they would know that. But
Anyone else have experiences? I know, Kristen, you went through the Vampire Masters at Open Grades Open Mind, which is the first one in the world. So
Wow.
yeah, how was that experience?
I enjoyed the class that I took, which it was basically you basically got one very big master's class on it, but then you had, of course, additional classes that had things to do with class, sex, and racism, and there was a focus on Jack the Ripper in a class, and then so each teacher kind of had a different focus. So you really only had one big actual class that focused specifically on vampires, even though the program was advertised as a vampire program. I actually found, Sam George was wonderful, of course, and that's her field, but some of the other professors in the program didn't really seem as on board with the direction. And I think in my cohort of 8 students, we only had 2 who actually ended up writing on vampires for the dissertation. When I went into my PhD program at a different university at Trinity, I kind of had a similar experience about a year and a half into the literature program. When I went to give my first differentiation, they didn't like the fact that it was a very modern 21st century vampire approach. They wanted Dracula or Polidori. They wanted something in the past. They didn't want something in the present. And I was looking at children in vampire texts, looking at Claudia, and John Lindquist Let the Right One In, and that kind of portrayal. And they were very adverse to the idea of the more modern. They wanted classic, which is why I'm now getting my PhD in creative writing.
Which is it's both sad and a good thing that both you and Amanda found that path, but it's the idea that there has to be some, actually we talked about this yesterday, there has to be some sort of canon that we invent, right? Mm-hmm. And I suspect it's because many of the people that become advisors are literature people. And so they know what is acceptable, which is one of the reasons why horror stories had to fracture, right? That only boys are allowed to write horror books and women just write romance, right? So then you have to create a whole nother genre so that women can be included. I think it's fascinating that even now in 2020, we're still having, maybe we will all get to the point where we become dissertation advisors. But Kristen's story makes me think of one thing we should all do. We should all bombard Sam George with emails about giving us a job because we all teach vampires. And then eventually we'll all get jobs, and then they'll have a program that's filled only with vampire scholars. And Becky.
I think there's a commonality. I think it extends beyond just the specific vampires, though. It's anything really modern that deals with horror, fantasy, or speculative fiction. Because even in my creative writing program, when I'd originally wanted in my undergraduate to focus on creative writing. And I was told in my undergraduate program, anything that qualified as speculative fiction would not be allowed in the program. No horror, no fantasy, no science fiction, which is why I went the literature path until my PhD. And now that I'm in a creative writing PhD program, one of the first things my supervisor said to me was, when we get to your Viva, we have to be very careful because you're writing fantasy. They want, and even this fantasy novel that I'm using is exceptionally grounded it's in 10th century Ireland in a fantasy setting, but aside from the girl having magic, it's as realistic as possible because they wanted it solidly grounded in something they could understand and follow it. You couldn't really write a true fantasy epic. I think some programs you probably can now, like Glasgow has really leading the way with their, they've become a center for fantasy in Europe. They launched the first master's degree in fantasy specifically a couple of years ago, and they hold the big JivCon conference. It got canceled this year, obviously, but they're trying. So some schools are trying to make strides, but a lot of them have to play catch up. They're just not quite there yet.
Thanks. And I think that really does summarize some of the things that we're noticing, right? That the classroom is moving much faster than the academy. So things that we're now allowed to do in the classroom, we're still not allowed to study as scholars, which just seems like a very strange thing. Kendra, I don't want to pick on you, but I'm super curious where you did your PhD, and were you allowed to do black vampires in your PhD, or was it something that you came to afterwards?
Hi, yes, I did my PhD at Howard University, and my book is from my dissertation, which was on black vampires. And I think part of that comes from Howard being forward thinking in many ways, the English department. It comes from my director, the late Greg Hampton, who wrote the first book on Octavia Butler. Wow. Right. And so that has a lot to do with it, but there was no backlash or blinking. There's a person on my committee who did graphic novels. And so like that was his interest. So I didn't have any of the pushback. It was more, as long as you can write a dissertation, make an argument out of it.
That's such a nice thing to hear. Although looking back, when I did my dissertation, I was in American Studies, and there was a lot of convincing to allow me to do anything that had to do with race. Right, I was supposed to just do something that was clearly acceptable American Studies, which was the white experience in America. So it took my American PhD director to convince my department that not only is a PhD supposed to be something that's new, not something that's repeating something that's done, but also your PhD should be something that is your passion, not something that you're just told to do. And so that was the only reason I was allowed to do it. And I've never seen anyone in that department since do a PhD on a topic that's not about whiteness, that intrinsically or otherwise. And I think that that's still so fascinating in 2020, that there are still such clear expectations in departments. So how many of you, so there was some good and some bad. So Billy, we met you through Dracula. Thank you. That was my first experience with you. And then it was the child vampire, both of which kind of, so tell me your experience about studying Dracula. And did you get any pushback studying queerness? Because that's also another element that I think, unless you're in women's and gender studies, you're not really allowed to study sexuality, queerness, etc.
Yeah. So I'm not in a PhD program. I just wrapped up my master's degree in library science. And so when I was first trying to study the vampire, it was not necessarily encouraged. It was more that no one in the department thought that it would be viable for me to write about that for my undergraduate honors thesis, so that I could graduate and go into grad school and do something. They're like, you should really focus in on something more grounded. I think I was actually told to focus on Irish studies, which I had no background in, but they were just like, oh, Bram Stoker has some ties to Ireland. Do you want to do something Irish? And I was like, no, I want to do something gay. Can I do something gay? We actually had, and I have been begging her to submit something and come and speak with all of us at some point, but Dr. Leora Lev at Bridgewater State started up a vampire studies class years and years and years ago, and it was sort of like in one of those freshmen, they were sort of like puff courses where it was like, oh, this is a fun thing that you can take because you just got here. Wouldn't it be like kooky to study the vampire? And she was like, this class is going to be really good. It's going to be really fun. It's also going to be really serious. So take it seriously. And I really did. And I tried to work with her and work with her and work with her. And the only reason she was able to teach the class was because she was so hyper tenured. She actually taught in our Spanish department. She was a foreign language professor that they were like, you can do whatever you want. And so nobody in my department could really be paired with me to do anything vampire related. A lot of the stuff that I had to find was on my own. I ended up working with one of the members of our American Studies faculty who had just started up our American Studies program, which really sort of influenced the fact that I couldn't just do Dracula. So I looked at Dracula, and then I looked at David Bowie's The Hunger, and then I looked at, yes, it was so good, it was so good. And then I looked at, for years I've been trying to get us to watch it, maybe next year, but it was, and then I wrapped it up with True Blood, because I had done so much research on Dracula that my current advisor couldn't advise me on. And so she was like, you need to transition to something American. And I was like, I can do that. And she's like, you need to transition to something super modern. I'm like, I can do that. And it came down to being really flexible. But it ultimately, while I was at University of Illinois, it was a little more flexible in how I could look at stuff. Nothing I could do that related to popular culture really, they said, didn't relate to the program, which is why I ended up building a journal, which is why I ended up having funding to come to PCA last year, because they said, you have a popular culture journal, so you have to go. And the biggest pushback that I've been getting is I'm in my first academic job right now, like a baby's first big time academic. Yes, it was very cool. It's really fun. And so when I got this job at Emory Law, I was like, yes, and I do this popular culture work, and I'm down to tie it to copyright and see if we can investigate these issues. Like, there are definitely ways they can frame that. And they were just like, no, you can't, nothing, no popular culture. You can do legal theory or nothing. And I'm not a lawyer. I have no background in law. They hired an outreach person because they needed a librarian that was fun and chatty, and that's what I am. And so the struggle has and continues to be, how can I get my work out there? And so my original pitch for PCA this year, I ramble, that's sorry, but that's my thing. But so my original pitch for PCA this year was discussing Dracula and copyright, because they were sort of still on the edge of, maybe we'll fund you if you weave legality into it. And so I did a very elaborate display on the Nosferatu copyright case between Prana Films and Florence Stoker, and it was a big display, all using open access resources. I dug really deep into it, and the people that ended up loving it was the marketing department. So our law school, while the library wasn't interested, students found it fascinating, and our marketing department actually reached out to me to interview me for our journal, that the magazine that goes out to all the alumni. So they were like, new staff member Billy Tringali is a vampire scholar. How crazy is that? And so it was, I actually managed to use my popular culture studies, and specifically my vampire studies, to be better as an outreach librarian. It allowed me to meet people from all across campus that I never would have had the opportunity to. I reached out to different departments. I met with other librarians in other libraries because they had resources that I needed. And it ended up being that spin of, look how good this is, in the way that I'm able to build all these connections. And so what I think, and where I think the vampire can uniquely succeed, is in its natural interdisciplinarity. We really gain an excuse to talk to other people, because as much as there is a vampire studies, all of us come from such vastly different backgrounds and approach the vampire in so many different ways, because there's so many different ways that it can be looked at and analyzed. And so while I wouldn't necessarily say it was 100% successful, the library still is just like, you want to do popular culture? How cute. Do that when you go home. That can be your fun thing that you do on the side. It still is something that I was able to bring into my experience. And so I think in terms of utilizing the vampire as, this is an interdisciplinary studies area, this is a way for me to do research or to meet people, I think that we have a very unique opportunity in what we study to do that.
Thank you. I think that makes a lot of really important points, right? That's one of the reasons why we can keep going. But what I find fascinating is how many of us, I guess, hid what we did, right? So I wouldn't include on my resume vampire presentations that I did unless they were explicitly about race. And certainly for the first couple of years that I went to the PCA, I didn't put it on my resume. Like I was in a history department in Chattanooga, and so they just didn't think pop culture was a thing. Like that's just something that kids do in their spare time. We certainly don't study it, so I would just pay it on my own, and then I wouldn't put it on my resume. But then eventually I just didn't care. Like it became more my passion, and I had a job. You're not going to fire me. So it felt more and more that I could do what I wanted to do, and the more I accepted it, the more it became part of who I am. And now that's how people think of me, as the vampire scholar, despite the fact that I teach primarily US history. That's the... So does anyone know of any other journals? That's the big thing. So there are things that we've been building out, like, so there's Dracula studies. I think Lisa's probably the most well-versed in the vampire journals that I keep seeing, because you keep telling me about them. So some of the big ones, I guess, are Dracula studies and Open Graves. Oh, and Buffy studies.
Yeah. There's Revenant, which is another e-journal. Yeah, and the Open Graves, they do special issues of things, like they did a special issues with Gothic studies, and then books out of their different conference, because they do sort of themed conferences. One was on the werewolf. They have one, I think they did on supernatural cities, but they partner with Gothic studies. That's another good space.
Are there any other journals that you think are welcoming, or actually that are intended to be for the vampire? Because that to me is the interesting thing. That
Yeah, there's Journal of the Fantastic and the Arts, and I think they're welcoming of supernatural, not just vampires, but for just vampires, I mean, Dracula Studies is the one that comes to mind.
has anyone published in Dracula Studies? Because I'm curious if it has to be about Dracula. You have.
Yeah. I published hair symbolism in Dracula. It was about Dracula. Yeah. I don't think it necessarily, it depends. Sometimes you do special issues, right? That are on different topics, but for like a general one, it's usually specifically Dracula related. Yeah.
If you publish on Blackness, you could consider the College Language Association Journal. It's not exclusively about vampires or the supernatural, but they're open to those publications. And again, if you're into Blackness, African American Review publishes on vampires, not exclusively, but Jeffrey Jenkins, who published a book on the paradox of Blackness, had his first article on vampires published in African American Review.
I know his name. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
What else on scholarship? So those of you who are in your PhDs or are in actively studying something in vampires, do you have any research questions or scholarship questions that we can help you with before we move on to the classroom? You've got your two librarians there.
Yeah, I was about to say librarian in the house. I also put a link into chat for the Science Fiction and Fantasy Research Database, which is an open access bibliography, now with over 119,000 citations on criticism and journal articles and stuff, on genre stuff. And I work really hard at trying to keep the vampire scholarship in there up to date too. So, you know, and if you see something that should be on there and it's not, you can ping me.
It's kind of surprising and happily overwhelming how much stuff there is out there. And I'm hoping, my big dream, because I'm never going to be famous, so my big dream is to bring all of this stuff together into one easily accessible place, because it's really hard, particularly with my undergraduates, to try and figure out where to find stuff. I think that's which for all of us in whatever discipline we're in, but for me in Black Studies, it got easier and easier and easier as we got better and better databases. So yeah, the more that we can collate all that stuff together. But that's for Billy and Kate to do, not for me. So.
I would love to. That would be great. That would be one thing that I think, specifically saying that I've experienced running the Journal of Anime and Manga Studies, is that there's a lot of undergrads that are really excited to do this type of popular culture research. And I think there's especially a ton of undergrads that are interested in researching the vampire. It's just the process of finding that information becomes so overwhelming. And I think the first people that they might go to is maybe the professor that's teaching that class, and then their response might not be the response that someone in this group would give them. It would be sort of like, well, why would you do that? Like, that's not going to be. And I think it's one of the questions that I get all the time through the anime studies email is, where do I start researching this? You know, how do I actually dig in? And what's very difficult from a librarianship perspective, like as a librarian that's not at their university, is you have no idea what resource access they might have. So we could recommend like a great journal, or there's this specific paper that you should really start with. But unless it's open access, there's no guarantee that our students would be able to go in and read that article. And so a lot of the times the papers that come about from this type of popular culture scholarship, although I'm projecting anime onto the vampire, which I will do anytime, if anyone's interested, I'm always down, is the papers that come about are shaped around what they're able to find as opposed to what they might be really passionate about.
That's very true. And I think it makes it harder that you're right, that a lot of people don't take it seriously. So I tend to get that most with my students, that they've been so convinced by everyone else that, well, vampires aren't something you study. So if I have to write a research paper, I just have to watch a movie, right? That's there's scholarship.
Oh, you need to find resources.
Yeah, not real scholarship though, just like,
right.
There are people who study this stuff and research it, and that's always been my hardest lift in the classroom, is convincing them that, that there is, not just convincing my students, but the first thing is convincing other professors, right, that there is some meaning to it. So, and I always remember the first time I did an ET presentation on the vampire, and at the end of it, someone who's totally converted now because he teaches zombies, Rob said, "Oh my God, I had no idea that the vampires had any kind of historical background. Really? So people actually study this stuff?" And I was like, but that was the point, like, that at least he said it. Then I could then explain why this was as important as any other field of research, and slowly but surely started converting people.
So bad idea here. What would a vampire studies reader look like?
This screen.
Not a bad idea. Excellent idea.
into the mini editors in the room. Hey.
Yeah, it's a thought, right? It's a thought.
Yeah. So what was the first time? And I know for me let me tell you my first time. So what was your first time? My first time using the vampire in the classroom was Dead Until Dark. So I read that book. I was like, holy shit, this is a great book that has nothing to do with vampires. It's all about race and class. So now I can finally use a book that has vampires in it, but use it to talk about something completely different. So I snuck that into my first year studies class, and it went so well. And then True Blood started, and then it all went horribly wrong. But it then helped me build slowly but surely a body of stuff that I could use in the classroom. And then finally, like 5 years later, I taught a class that was just about vampires. But slowly but surely, I just kind of snuck in text that had a vampire in it. But really, the point of the text was more about bigger issues that I could, and which is back to Billy's point, why the vampire is such an interdisciplinary image that you can use in any way. So what were your experiences the first time you used it in the classroom, or the first course that you taught? Lisa, you teach a vampire lit class.
I do. I teach a course on the horror novel every fall, and then I do a vampire seminar, which is mostly for honor students, although it's open to all students. That's maybe like every 2 years I can teach that class. And I think the students are, they love, we were talking a moment ago about, current trends in the field, and I think the new-ish name monster studies, I think that really seems to capture what we're talking about, and that's doing it in a more accessible way. Because I get the jokes from my colleagues, oh, haha, what are you reading now? Funny. Like, no, not really. It's very serious. But when I say it's monster studies, it's got this theme, and then it seems to have a little more legitimacy. I love teaching the vampire, although, I wish I could do my vampire seminar all the time. I can't, just because of staffing reasons, but I can do my horror novel once a year and sneak in vampires in that. But yes, it's primarily lit. I do some film in the vampire seminar and in the horror novel, but mostly literature.
And to be clear, both Lisa and I teach at really small schools. So my school, and Becky's there too. So Carrie is 2,500 students. So it makes it
Sienna's the same.
it makes it a little harder to kind of design classes that will fill just because you have such a small
Right.
population. So then it does mean that you're doing a marketing job to get students in the classroom.
Yes. Oh, it is. It is.
Amanda, can you tell us a little bit about using the vampire to teach wider issues? Because I had you come to my class last time to specifically not talk about the vampire, but instead to talk about trauma. So yeah, so how do you use it outside of the classroom?
So one of the things, I mean, I've been doing this for a while, is that my approach to teaching social justice issues is to use pop culture, and specifically for me, the vampire, because that's the thing that I've been doing for the longest. But I do use other images depending on what's most popular sometimes at the moment with our students. 2 years ago, I did a talk on my monster boyfriend. Or technically it was called my monster significant other. So I talked about why we're so attracted to monsters and why like we have this new trend of romantic monsters and that kind of thing. And then I actually turned it into a talk about knowing the signs of an abusive relationship. It was during domestic violence month. And so talking about some of that stuff. So one of the things that I have long done is taken the things that are super popular, whether it's a zombie, but again, vampires are the thing, and then talk about the things that we all talk about, the way that monsters are metaphors, and but then use the language that they're all familiar with. So sometimes that's superheroes, sometimes that's vampires, but using the language that we all share in common around popular culture to then talk about those very difficult issues. So race, queerness, trauma. I know when I came to talk to Melissa's class, I talked about experiences of trauma and the way that impacts the neurobiology of the brain, and why vampires may be a good key to looking at things like intergenerational trauma. So that's sort of what I do. And again, I just use pop culture as sort of a shared language and a way for us to talk across our differences, whether that's race, gender, sexual orientation, or things like political difference. It's a little hard to like have some of these conversations. I'm in a very conservative school right now. And so thinking about some of the things, I have much more open conversations when I talk about True Blood, or when I talk about The Shape of Water, for instance, or why hipster Hulk is our best boyfriend ever. It's easier to have those conversations in the political landscape I have right now with a lot of conservative students, that I can couch the conversation in something that's slightly removed from them. Something they're super passionate about.
And you've been in it for so long that you've become like the world's expert on, and that really helped me this semester. So I teach a JYI called the Global Vampire. Last time it really wasn't the Global Vampire, it was really American Vampire, and then I stuck in a couple of anime things. This time it truly is the Global Vampire because I have the book. But what I did each week was invite somebody who I thought had nothing to do with vampires, who could talk about, so the JYI is about using a topic to talk about interdisciplinary studies. So each week I would bring someone from the discipline in. So I brought someone in from psychology, and this is what I mean about hiding what you do. It turns out the woman from psychology that I brought in is one of 5 people in the world who is qualified to judge people who have Renfield syndrome. And she never told anybody that she does it. Renfield syndrome is actually, now it's in the American Psychological Book, right? So it's actually a real thing. And she never told anybody because she was so embarrassed about it. But she's one of 5 people in the entire world who gets called in when kids exhibit signs of Renfield syndrome, because of course it's one of the steps towards becoming a serial killer. And so it was so fascinating, I know. And then I said, I've got to tell everybody. She's like, no, don't tell anybody. I don't want people to know about it. I just did it for your class. So, and she actually told my students, don't go telling people that's what I do. People think I'm a clinical psychologist. That's what I do. Which, I mean, you're one of 5 people in the world who do something. I wouldn't be telling everybody. That'd be my t-shirt. I'm one of 5. But so that to me is the fascinating thing, that even when it's part of your professional career, the vampire is still too embarrassing a term to use, or just not looked at as seriously, so you end up hiding it. Yeah. Becky, did you tell your department that you were going to the PCA to do a presentation on on vampires, that use vampires? Oh wait, I muted you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's on my CV too, but I don't know if I mean, you know me, like, I don't have a filter or a whole lot of fear. I mean, like, I don't know. I'm just, I don't know if I'm like the norm. Like, if I do something, if I put my heart into it, I'm proud of it. Like, yeah. But then, I have supportive colleagues like you, obviously, but even in CJ, the people that I choose to spend time with, and support and accept their support, like, they're good. They're not judgy people. They're not, you know what I mean?
Definitely. And that's the difference for me coming from Chattanooga to Curry, is I never would have done vampires in Chattanooga. But here I can do whatever I want because my department's so supportive of me just being alive and doing stuff. And publishing, that's the thing, right? So you can end up doing it. But teaching is a little harder. And it is very difficult to get. Like, I got 5 emails today about my global vampire class. Like, is this a serious class? Like, what do we do in this class? And because it's advising right now, right? So, and I'm like, did you ask the person who's teaching shopping if it was a serious class? Because why are you asking me, right? So, yeah, it is still a fascinating. Kendra, you said you teach a class on black vampires. You're at the University of Georgia, I think.
I am. And yes, I do teach a class on black vampires.
Does it feel what the students like? Did it take some seducing to get them on board with the topic? Or do they come in knowing that that's what they want to study?
So it's interesting. I just started at Georgia Southern in August. And so I taught my first vampire class last fall. And the class was full the day after it was put on the schedule. So it's a 2100 course, which is essentially, it's a general education course. So it's a gateway studies course. And one of the students in the class told another student who was like, I like this class a lot better than I thought I would. And he said, anytime you have a course like 2100, it's always best to take the ones with the weird titles because they're usually the most fun, right? And you learn a lot. He was like, so I thought that was really sweet. I will be teaching this course again this summer and apparently also in the fall. I don't know how that's all going to work out, but the summer course, I need 5 more people to fill. So it's got 30 in it already. And we posted it on our department's Instagram page, and we had students asking for the reading list. I mean, not students, we had those visiting the page asking for the reading list, or if the professor would be willing to post videos that might be accessible just so folks who weren't enrolled in the class could have access to it. And then even at my previous institution, while I didn't teach an entire course on vampires, I always at least had one vampire text or reference. And so it's always been fairly fruitful, right? I never had to hide it on my resume or my CV. Everything I've done is either science fiction or vampires. And so it's always been an asset for me.
I would love to see your syllabus. That seems like a very cool class to teach that's very specific.
Thanks.
That does sound fascinating, really.
Thanks.
If you're not in the Facebook group, please be in the Facebook group and share that.
I am in the Facebook group. Yes.
Maybe that's something that we should do, that is share, if you want to, share your syllabi so we can see. I don't want you to steal from each other, but, well, yeah, actually you do. Share from each other. Yeah, share your syllabi. We did it one time, and I totally pretty much used Kate and Candace's entire reading list for the first time I taught first year inquiry. But so it does become really useful to share what we're doing. So what's your favorite novel to use? I've tried to use Let the Right One In once, and that scene is just too traumatic, where he has his penis bitten off. So what's your favorite text to use in the novel? Last year I used Stevenson's An Idiot's Guide to Vampires, which sounds like a strange book to use. It is the most comprehensive text on the vampire, written in a fun, accessible way. And once the students got past the title of the book, it's the best vampire textbook I've used. It was really, really cool. So what's your favorite text or movie, I guess, or TV show to use beyond Buffy?
I've enjoyed teaching I Am Legend. Yeah. And then I pair it with the the Will Smith movie, which has problems, but students really genuinely, and it's a thin, as you guys know, I Am Legend is not that long of a read. And so I found students really enjoy it.
And that's interesting. When we taught a monsters class, which had a zombie section, a vampire section, a horror section, and a sound of fear section, we used I Am Legend. And the debate was this a vampire movie or a Dracula movie or a zombie movie?
Right.
And it was super rich because all the kids in the zombie class had perfect arguments about why it was a zombie movie. And the vampire kids had perfect arguments about why obviously it's a vampire movie. But it's true, he does not say they're vampires. So you can't really make the argument that we make them vampires, and they're obviously vampires. But he thought they were aliens. So that's another fascinating. So yeah, that's a really good text. And also it's good because it's got the companion film, but the book is short enough that even if it's not a literature class, you can use it. So Billy, what do you use? What was your favorite thing that drew you in? Was it Dracula?
It was super, super cool to start with Dracula, but and this is going to reveal, I think there was some stuff in the chat about how Whedon Studies sort of co-opted Buffy, but we watched the Buffy versus Dracula episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I had no higher ed experience, and I was just so wildly blown away. I'm like, we're watching a TV show in this college class. This is crazy. And then we had a really intense discussion, and we had really intense readings paired with it. And I was just so swept up into just how I was like, this is such a modern thing. This is such a cool thing, and we're allowed to do this. So it was Dracula that lured me in, because I was like, I feel like this is really, really queer. And luckily my professor was like, it is. That's good. Write about that. Do that. But it was, so that had me locked in. But then what sort of really caused me to totally sink my teeth into vampire studies was having Buffy involved.
So Buffy versus Dracula I use, and then Silence, or is it Silence, or it's called Hush?
Hush, yes.
Those are the 3 episodes that they always use. But Hush is just a genius.
It's really good. It's still really, really good.
It holds up so well. Yeah, it's really good.
I was going to tag along to that. Many moons ago, I was back in 2002, 2003, and I was an undergrad taking media studies courses, and this was when the first wave of Buffy scholarship was happening. And so one of our course assignments was to find a book of popular studies scholarship and do a book report on it. And there was a list of suggested books, and I'm like, I just bought this book called Fighting the Forces. It's about Buffy studies. And my professor straight up said, you bought a book of popular culture criticism? Awesome, do it. So that was what happened. Was I was like, ooh, you mean criticism of Buffy? Tell me more. And it was all uphill or downhill from there.
I think she's the doorway that shows the doorway for many of us, right? That it was such a deep thinking show, but it was also still so much fun. That was And what about Fledgling? I've used it once. I'm definitely going to use it now again. Octavia Butler, just because the graphic novel has come out, so it makes it really easy then for me to pair them. I still don't know why there's no movie.
It's coming.
Yeah.
Oh,
I think that's what I've read recently. I'll Google.
Yeah, that would make sense though, because since the graphic novel's come out, there's a lot of renewed interest in it. So hopefully, yeah, the movie would be fantastic. But Fledgling is a great book because of the way it looks at what race means and what blood means. But then there's also back to the whole problems of the child vampire, which...
I taught Fledgling for the first time, I guess last fall. I did my seminar, and I had I work mostly chronologically. So we start, with Carmilla, Dracula, et cetera, move up. And Fledgling was one of the last ones, and it pulled together, I thought, really nicely Interview with the Vampire, Let the Right One In, and all those conversations really folded in. I think with all the rich things that Fledgling has already in it, I thought it was a nice way of intersecting some ideas. So I would love to teach it again when I teach the seminar.
Kendra, I see your hand up. Oh, hang on, how do I unmute you?
Okay, there we go. I was like, what just happened? So yeah, Fledgling isn't a graphic novel yet, but Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents are. But Fledgling, I teach Fledgling, and it works really well. My students have to get over, I don't want to necessarily spoil it, but just get over the sex scenes in it, right? Not because they're sex scenes, but because of the perceived age difference. But and then a really close second, I don't know which is the favorite yet, but Jewel Gomez's The Gilda Stories is a really good one to teach. I had one student who absolutely loved it, not only because it allowed us to look at, that was in an African American lit class, it allowed us to go over the themes that we'd already discussed in class, but we could talk about passing, queerness, invisibility, disability, all through that particular text, and see how those concepts translate across historical time, which is what the novel itself does. And so those are two really fun ones to teach, and they definitely generate a lot of conversation in the classroom.
I use the Gilda Stories in African American history as it happens, because again, you're right, it's so historical, and it's a really great way to get them into that. I used to have a time traveling one in African American history. I had this idea that I would teach history backwards, but I'm too chronological a thinker, and it messed up my brain too much. So the whole class fell to pieces as I ended up flipping the chronology. So, but it was a cool way for them to think, what does history really mean? And if you could really go back in history, what would it really mean? So yes, there's a really good body of stuff out there. Amanda.
Oh, just the announcement that Cheryl Dunye is directing an adaptation of the Gilda Stories, which is super exciting for television. When that's coming, I think maybe next year, but that's pretty exciting. So
I hope it's on a good network so that they don't have to pull any punches.
I feel like it's a streaming network is who bought the rights, either Amazon or Netflix or Hulu or something like that. So
that'd be great. And I already can see who the cast should be.
Yeah.
Really cool. Yeah. I know. Other thoughts, other things that texts that you used or wish you could use. I mean, I think for me, Let the Right One In is one of my favorite novels, but it's a good example of how when you read something for yourself, it doesn't necessarily work in the classroom, right? So that text for me in a history class when a first year studies was just too long as well. So I could only use that one novel when I like to use a bunch of text. I know my history professors always like, you used fiction in your history class, but it's fiction, it's not history. I'm like, dude, take a history class, you'll figure out that it is history. But yeah, so I find that it's trying to find things that are short enough. And I've tried working through graphic novels and finding, like, trying to get them to have a different piece of different types of media. And so the thing that I found the most difficult was trying to pick which graphic novel is the best thing, right? So sometimes an adaptation of a novel, going back to the Laurel Clay Hamilton novels, the graphic novels are awful, but sometimes, and then also you have to think about the accessibility. So some graphic novels are created to be paper text, so they don't have the zoomability when they go online. And that was the problem with, that to me has been the problem with all the Octavia Butler adaptations, is you can't zoom in. So it's really impossible to read them on your screen. So there were all sorts of issues with using that kind of stuff. But if anyone discovered a graphic novel or actually a film that they've been using or would like to use in their classrooms?
I would say in my undergrad Gothic class, we used Let the Right One In, but as the film, not as the text. So we had Dracula as the text, Let the Right One In, and then Nosferatu as the films for the vampire portion of that class.
Did you use both versions, or did you just use the American version? Or actually, yeah, which is which, Lisa? Let Me In is the Swedish.
Let Me In is the American one.
Yeah,
we use the Swedish.
We use the Swedish. My supervisor said, "Don't bother watching the American version."
It's a little different.
Yeah,
it's still a cool movie about bullying. It's one of the things about the PCA that's so great is last year. So first, I learned about child vampires from Lisa. Last year, it was the Transfiguration that I got obsessed with. And that is a movie that you should use in class. It is such a great bridge between the fictional world of a vampire and then the reality of human beings in our world becoming vampires. And what happens when you consume all that media and then you're terribly traumatized, where does that take you? Now I would say it's my favorite vampire movie to use in class. And out of all the films that we watched, that was the movie that they got the most conversation out of, because it was so grounded in their experience and so grounded in a world that they recognized. And that was why I had Amanda come in and talk about trauma.
They had such a brilliant conversation about that film.
That was the only good conversation we had about a film. It felt like that was the only film they watched. It was really, so for whatever reason, they had so much to say about it. And it was the best film to use for non-vampire content as well. So I think I might weave it into my other classes, but it's a difficult one. Have you guys seen Transfiguration?
Not yet.
You would love it. I think we've had this conversation. Lisa, you would love it with the child vampire stuff.
I know. It's on my list. I really would like to watch that. Yeah.
Watch it if I had kids. Yeah.
On the topic of things we were inspired by, at last year's PCA, Lena gave a paper on The Night Wanderer by Drew Hayden Taylor, I think is the name. Native American vampires. That was a great read if any of you are looking for some quarantine reading, and if you haven't had a chance to check it out, that was great. I learned about that at last year's conference. That was really fascinating.
And there was one on, I know it was last year or the year before, was the one that I ended up going and reading the entire American Vampire series, was pulp vampire fiction from the late 1890s, so cowboy comics and stuff.
Yes.
That was
Yes, I remember that paper. Yes, I can imagine. I know the person. Yeah, I don't remember, the name is escaping me, but yes.
That's what we use the PCA for.
Yeah.
So who's excited about Blade? Oh, wait, how do you feel about the new casting of Blade? That's what I want to ask you.
I'm brokenhearted because they canceled my San Diego Comic-Con tickets this morning, and I was supposed to be in Hall H.
That would have been this is the year to go, of course, I know.
I was a panelist last year with Game of Thrones, so I had my tickets lined up this year, and I hadn't received a confirmation if I was on a panel or not, but I was waiting, and they canceled them this morning. And yes, I was planning to be at the Blade San Diego Comic-Con panel.
I might have been the only year I was going to go. That's very sad. So do you guys all know who the new guy is? I'm going to mess up his name, so I'm not going to say it.
Mahershala Ali.
Oh.
Yeah.
Right? That is who's playing him, right?
It is.
Yes.
Okay.
He's just a much more soulful actor. And I think he fits more with the graphic novel for me, or at least the latest iteration of the graphic novels. So he's a much more it's going to be a very different movie. I think I'm a huge fan of his as an actor, but it's going to be a very different movie from Wesley Snipes. And so Wesley Snipes to me is like the black Keanu Reeves, or Keanu Reeves is the black Wesley Snipes. Really good at beating people up, just not so good at the talking bit, which is why Blade worked for me, because I think that he doesn't talk like Blade. So shut up, Billy. That's an academic description. So in the classroom, do students take your class and then go on and do other vampire things, or other monster things, I should say, or is this the island that they have? So at Curry, there's one other class that looks at The Walking Dead, but there are no other monster classes. So if they're into monsters, they got to take my first year inquiry, my American Vampire, my junior inquiry, and then the zombie class, and that's their entire monster experience. So do you sit in an island, or are there other courses that connect to you? Or are there other courses that students can take once they've gotten obsessed with the vampire in your class?
I am in an island. I think there is sympathetic faculty and classes that pair well, but there's no other monster themed classes. unfortunately. Although I have had students go on to do like honors theses on projects where they can do more independent research. But no, I wish.
How do we change that? Like, is there a way? Is it just a question of teaching? I think at Curry, it's been more, the more I do it, the more people think that it works, and so it's more acceptable. But how do we get the classroom to be more monster related? Is it weaving more monster text into our regular classes? That's an interesting way of putting it. Our other classes, yeah, what is the solution? Is there a solution that we can use to convert the entire classroom, the entire college experience?
Yeah.
I think if we all work together, so Amanda starts with the students on the
I think
outside
it's
of the classroom.
weaving it in.
Yeah. So I'm teaching US history as biography in the fall, and I can't think of a vampire text for that. Oh, I lost your voice. Is it me?
Yeah. What was the name of the class?
US history as biography.
Ooh.
What about Abraham Lincoln Vampire?
Kill?
That's true. That's very good.
Yeah.
I hate it, but that's actually a good.
It's awful.
I actually like the Jane Austen one better. Yes, but that's actually a good point. What do we do with history? And yeah, that's actually not a bad one. Actually, Gilda stories might work. No, it's not really biography. Yeah, that's a good one.
Do you ever incorporate any folklore into your class?
Yeah.
Yeah. Folklore.
Particularly in Massachusetts, we've got a couple of vampire panics that we can use.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I've always wanted to incorporate more folklore, real ritualistic, type some vampire stuff into it. Yeah. So you could do that in history.
Yeah, that's true. I'm not so much. I don't use a lot of folklore in my other history classes so much because it's uncomfortable for me. But yeah, it's definitely easier and easier the more contemporary you get, because there's more. Certainly, once you get to the 90s, there are more. The vampires become. We've gotten so used to the vampire pop culture that kids have been absorbing it, and then that's now changing our psychological issues. So that's the way that I tend to absorb it in when I do US history too. Is talk about modern day trauma and the ways in which students, young people, reflect that trauma in different ways. And the vampires are fascinating way that they've begun to, well, actually the 90s is probably late, but the ways in which they've incorporated into their lives and use that as the way to reflect the traumas that they're feeling. That's one way. But yeah, Massachusetts has a surprising number of vampire panics. Yeah.
It's a good state. It's a solid state. It's a very
fucked up state. Yeah, it's the. Yeah.
So I actually have a real suggestion.
Yes.
What about Interview with the Vampire, in which the vampire is telling their own biography to a journalist because they desperately want companionship?
Of course. Yes, you're right. Thank you. And actually, that's great because I always use Claudia's story because I love that it's fanfic ultimately, and I also love the version of the story, the version of Interview with the Vampire that Claudia's story tells. So those are two things that would marry each other. I feel like this whole conversation is about how to make my class better.
Oh, that's a great idea. I really like that, Amanda. That's a really good idea, Amanda. I really like that. I taught Interview with the Vampire once and showed the film, and apparently all my students told all their friends, and so they all showed up to watch it because it's such an old film. None of them had really seen it before. Yeah. So
old.
Yeah. But they enjoyed it. They're like, that's Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. They couldn't even believe it. Yeah. For those who've heard of them. Yeah. But I really enjoyed teaching it. Mm-hmm.
And Queen of the Damned is good. I mean, to be fair, it's a terrible movie, but it's also a really good movie for looking at the impact of media. And I mean, there are some better supernatural episodes that do this, but if you were really a vampire, how would you hunt down humans? You would literally tell them you were a vampire because they would find that cool and sexy, and then they would fall for it, right? So that's, yeah, so, I mean, I particularly I use the supernatural episode where they're hunting vampires who are pretending to be Twilight vampires, and it's a very clever meta episode. But yeah, I like that Interview with the Vampire idea. Thank you. Back to Claudia. Do other people have teaching problems that they can solve rather than solving all my teaching problems?
Well, one thing that I've noticed, not as not as somebody that teaches, but as somebody who looks at the vampire, is, and I think it circles back to the theme of the night. It's that there is this there's a sort of respectability in Dracula, that it's considered to be such a classic that if you place it in a situation where it's like, oh, well, we're not just looking at the vampires, like we're starting with Dracula, like we're using this horror novel to expand things out. And there is so much there about, because every part of Dracula comes from personal diary entries, that everything is people telling their own story and their own version of this interaction. But that even when I was building the display, it was a Halloween display, so it was allowed to be about vampires, but starting back with, oh, well, there's actually this fascinating capes that goes back to Dracula. And they're like, oh, yeah, of course, that makes sense. You can start working on that. Like, everybody knows Dracula. Like, oh, yeah, that's a fine thing to look at. It's old. You can use it. But there's sort of the thinking of Dracula in the academy, and how just from an outreach perspective, that now that everybody at my school knows that I'm a vampire scholar, one of the first things that they come up, they're like, have you seen this show or read this specific book? And I'm just like, no, but I'm gonna. I love that. Thank you. It's an easy conversation booster. It makes my job a lot easier, because they're like, oh, you're the vampire dude. Yeah, I'll talk to you about this. Isn't this fun? But it all comes back to when I was pitching it to administration, when I was pitching it to my bosses to make the display, it was all like, oh, well, there's this classic piece of literature. There's this respectable thing. And nobody wants to talk to me about Dracula. Like, on the day-to-day, nobody's interested. People want to talk about the more modern stuff, the vampire stuff that they are looking at. So I think it's interesting between the way that Dracula has grown in the minds of the academy to what students are really interested in looking at. And like you said, Melissa, you were like, the movie that they watched was a modern one. What really got the students locked in was like, oh, this is new. Yeah, this sounds really cool. I'd like to watch that.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I just saw the time. It's 8:51.
Oh.
So I know. So let's wrap up by talking about next year. As you're talking, one thing to note is, yes, most people will do their papers they want to do next year. I really am all about The Hunger. I don't know why we haven't done it. Each year we do a throwback movie. So this year it was Bram Stoker's Dracula. We've done Lost Boys. What else have we done, Lisa?
The Hunger has been on our poll for...
I keep putting it on the poll.
I know. And I vote for it too. Maybe we move it up this time. We've been talking about it for years.
It is the classic 80s movie, and we no longer have
so good.
If you guys haven't seen The Hunger, it is a beautiful, beautiful version of the vampire story.
Catherine Deneuve, David Bowie, Susan
It's
Sarandon.
amazing.
And it's all shot in 80s soft focus. It's beautiful.
Well, what we want to do for next year is really push queering the vampire and so forth. You know, having that as the movie watch along, and then a related panel would make a heck of a lot of sense.
That's actually a very good idea. We had thought about doing some ramp up as we move up to the conference, so having some watch parties and stuff. And then I always think people are too busy, but that's actually a really good idea. Mm-hmm. And then picking something that is either clearly, well, no, actually, because all vampire films, I think, deal with queerness. So picking a film, and The Hunger is a perfect film for that, right, Billy?
Yeah, it's very good. It's very, very good. It's just...
I don't know any other throwback films that you guys want to watch. For whatever reason, we're 90s people, so we seem to have stuck in the 90s.
That's true.
Yeah. We did Lost Boys last year. No, was it last? Yes, last year, The Lost Boys.
I made a shirt. I made this for my mom for Mother's Day, and I had to do a test one, so it says, I'd rather be watching The Lost Boys. That one.
Why didn't you make all of us one, Billy?
Next year. I have time.
Maybe one, though.
Kate has proposed that we stay late, by the way, in the chat.
Okay.
I'm fine with it.
If people need to hop off,
yo, what else are we going to do? Come on. This is on brand for us.
This is true. How about Blade?
I want to mention how about what do you guys think of Shadow of the Vampire?
I just watched that when I fell down that Dracula black hole the other night.
Yeah.
Really
People hate it or love it, kind of. Yeah, it's one of those types of movies. I find it pretty. I hated it the first time I saw it, and then once I got past like the 15 minutes of the beginning sequence, and then the bat and I really like that one as a possible idea for a screening.
And it's a very good classic film. I mean, another one that we've never even mentioned is Blackula. I mean, given that Blade is coming back again, Blackula is another really classic one that really deals with queerness, and and it deals with so many other things, and it's also fun. So it's
If we ever do a humorous, vampire session, we could do Dracula Dead and Loving It and Blackula, which I think is funny. He's like, I'll have a Bloody Mary, and stuff like that. Yeah.
That'd be a good one.
Love at First Bite.
Yeah.
I love Love at First Bite.
I really like Dracula Dead and Loving It.
I love Mel Brooks. It's not as good as Young Frankenstein, and people compare it to Young Frankenstein, but it's not going to be Young Frankenstein. But I still find it hilarious. I mean, he steps in bat poop. That's so funny.
I use Young Frankenstein to talk about the death of feminism in the 1970s. Perfect. Yeah, it's in that monster class. What other ideas? I mean, maybe Gilda will be out. I like the idea of sticking with. If we do, because we usually do two roundtables, one where we show something and talk about it, and then one where you've watched it beforehand and then we talk about it. And with our intent this year was to do Castlevania, we could work Billy to the bone.
Which I love. I'm very down. Listen,
I'm wondering if disease is our thing next semester. So the apocalypse, right? The kind of, we survived the apocalypse, now here's a show about it. But the only ones that come to mind to me, well, I guess True Blood works, but actually the episodes about Lilith.
Yeah, the episodes have worked well because I know sometimes those 90-minute, you have to have a double one for a whole film.
Bye, Dorothy.
Episodes are great.
Bye.
Bye, Dorothy.
Sorry, Lisa.
That's all right.
Keep going.
So yeah, so you need a double session. So that's why Castlevania worked, because you can watch that in one session and still talk about it.
Yeah.
As opposed to a Buffy, which is an hour long, well, actually 42 minutes, but nevertheless. So yeah, those shorter shows work. I think V-Wars is 42 minutes, but it's not very good.
But do we want to subject everyone to V-Wars?
Yes. A lot to talk about then. But I think it works better when it's an old show that we're going back to. Dark Shadows might be something worth going back to. Right. And I want to say it would have been a couple of years ago. So I want to say there must be a podcast now, because I've gone back to listening to the radio show because they started doing the radio show again. So I don't know if they've done a podcast, but that's also something that's worth, if we're thinking about something like Shadow of the Vampire and then Dark Shadows, so the history of the vampire, that's another one. So we'll put out a poll like we always do on which movie to pick, and we'll put Hunger at the top and see what happens this year. And I guess, the Shadow Vampire. Oh, did we ever do Catherine Bigelow?
Near Dark?
Near Dark.
Oh.
No, we did not.
That's another one. It was a little similar to Lost Boys because it's that same genre of the single mother and what happens with the death of the family. That's another really cool one. I wonder if that's more popular with American audiences. The other thing we want to think about, remembering the globalization, is maybe there's a throwback that we haven't seen that comes from outside of the US or the UK. So,
or do we need to do The Scholar Walks Alone? Walks at Night. Well, I always screw up that.
Oh yeah, the K-drama.
The Kate Coker drama. Yes.
Okay, but if you do that, you're going to just have to listen to me talk about how much I love Lee Joon-gi. By the way, because the world is very small, Lee Joon-gi, who plays the lead in Scholar Who Walks the Night, also plays one of the bad guys in the most recent Resident Evil movie, which also has vampires in it, kind of, sort of. So, full circle.
There you go. Then we could also, I know a lot of people who love the Resident Evil movies, so yes, we could do a full circle of both things. I like the idea of a Scholar Walks Home, only because I started watching it because of you, and I really like it. And I'm the faculty advisor for the Geek Squad, who are this group of students who like geeky stuff, which hence their name. And that's their new favorite show as well. There's also another anime that they really like that has vampires in, but it was just too weird. It was that giggly kind of anime that I don't like. So, but yeah, that's another good option. Because of course, Castlevania was our attempt to broaden our focus from Buffy. So that's another good location to go in. And then I'm hoping Gilda is out, because if that is, that's another good.
Very nice.
Yeah, that would be a great episode to show. So keep thinking about that. What I will do after this is I will set up a thread on Facebook so you can upload your links. I'll go through the chat and see if I can copy and paste some of them. But if you had any links you wanted to add, that would be great. And then we'll leave it like a week, and then we'll put the poll up for the movie. That way you've all forgotten the conversation and you'll see Hunger and you're like, oh my God, I really want to watch the Hunger. And then it all okay, other final thoughts for us on Vampires in the Academy and scholarship? Or we can keep the conversation going after 9 for those of you that want to stay. But any other final thoughts you want to share with us? I was sad Anthony Hogg couldn't make it, because remember his presentation on was it Monsters in New Zealand? I couldn't find any of those movies, but that was our best out of the coffin paper.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I was wondering if the professors have any advice, maybe for students who are trying to get travel grants from their departments or even from the PCA itself, because the moment you say vampires or fantasy or fairies, they go and give the funding to, you know, something that sounds more literary.
I agree. I mean, the PhD students, you guys have any suggestions?
Well, I have one from the Dean of Students perspective, which is, first of all, check with your foundation office. Your institution will have a foundation, which they hold the major purse strings for the institution. And often they have travel funds for students that most students don't know about. They tend to hide. So check with your foundation to see if they have any of those things, or if they have research money for students. That's the way to do that, and then we can then help you craft your argument for how going to PCA is research, or whatever the conference is you're looking to do is research. So check with the foundation office first, then check. So I know that you're in a country that doesn't necessarily have student affairs per se, but there's likely a dean of students or something like that. Check with them. So check with the non-academic folks to see what scholarship money they have for students. Sometimes student organizations on your campus have funds. So like our student government has funds for graduate and undergraduate students to go. They're often more of a lottery than like you know, it's research based, right? So they don't tend to look at what you get out of it or what the topic is, but you at least can apply for money that way. So that'd be my like AJ is the Dean of Students moment. So there you go.
Oh, and that's very similar, thank you, to Curry. So the money is kind of hidden behind in the academic affairs office, but we have grants for students to go to any conference, and because they get so few applications, they don't really look at the description. They look more at the fact that you're going to a conference. So and it does seem like you're right. I think they got that idea actually, Billy, from Bridgewater, who were giving out those $1,000 research grants.
Oh yes, I got a couple of those. All my PCA stuff was originally through those. And it was, again, going to academic affairs, but it was also pitching it as, so this goes back to, again, I think the elaborate dance of the academy, but when I was pitching to present in PCA Vampires, I was saying that I was talking about Victorian women's history, because I was. I just happened to be doing that through Dracula. It was like, I'm like, I am doing that, and this is the place to do that. And they were like, that sounds fine. Yep, go ahead. There was more than just, and this happened at UIUC too, when I was trying to get money to go to PCA again. It was not just the academic affairs person, but there was always an assistant to someone, usually a secretary, and I say this because my mom's a secretary, that knows where everything is. And so I went when I was at Bridgewater, I bought her flowers and I walked into her office and I went, I'm going to need your help a lot. And it worked. And I was very appreciative and she was very happy to help me. And the same thing happened at UIUC. There'll be someone who is in control of the purse strings who knows what form to fill out because it's always tucked away somewhere else.
And it used to be at the PCA that you could get the travel grants because no one was applying for them. But since schools have had less and less money, they're getting more and more competitive. And I don't know the trick to getting a PCA grant. To me, the PCA surprisingly is quite conservative, even though they've got the new leadership. They're quite a traditionalist when it comes to the things. They're Shakespeareans, they're whatever. There's nothing wrong with being a Shakespearean, but for that to me might be the issue, is kind of get beyond them. But I just don't know. All I know is that the PCA has just gotten increasingly competitive over the years. As it used to be really that students applied, but now we're all applying because many of our schools don't have any travel funds at all. And also independent scholars can apply, and it's probably the only place the independent scholars can get travel funds. So the other thing that I noticed, Kristen, for a number of my students who are trying to go to a conference this year, is that go with their identity. So if they are a female student, there are organizations for that. If they're Black, there are organizations for that. If they're a scientist, there are organizations for that. And then the other trick to getting, if they can get the paper accepted, is to go to wider conferences that are not triggered as pop culture. That also helps. So a number of, and this is happening all over the academy, a number of big ones, like AHA is a good one, where they're realizing that more and more of their PhDs are doing pop culture. And so they're becoming more and more open to doing it. So sometimes it's finding the association of biology, and they're like, oh my God. And then of course, if you do that, you seem like the coolest person at the whole conference because you're the person doing something different to everybody else. So that's the other thing. It's hiding your chocolate among the carrots. So that's a good question. Thank you, Kristen. And I think as time goes on, it's going to get harder and harder to find funding because schools are realizing that you'll go to the conference whether we give you money or not. So why are we giving you money? I think that's the scary.
That's a question that I see on the form is, if we don't give you this, what will you do? And to me, it feels like a trick question. Because if you can say, well, I'm going to go anyway, then what do you need the money for?
I always tell people to say that I can't come without this funding. Because, why are you asking me that question? That seems really, what business is it of yours? What other funding I'm getting? That's really sneaky. So, and then the other thing that they tend to do, and this is only hearsay, is they will privilege those people who don't have an academic position, because they'll assume that your school will give you funding. So if you're a student or an independent scholar, you go theoretically you go higher on the list because it's more likely that you won't have any other funding. But this year we tried to ask them to increase the funding, but then we got a whole load of reasons, and actually it turned out maybe they're right, that people often will get funding and then not show up at the conference at all. And so then they've assigned that money and now someone else can't get it. So, and I think they've gotten a little gun shy with that. That's but yeah, that's the thing. I also think this year is going to teach us that we can do more virtual conferences. I mean, it's a lot of work, but why not? Why can't we do more stuff like this? And this enables us to have people from all over the world, and it's free. It doesn't cost you any money to do it, but you can still put it on your resume. We had that one person last year, do you remember, who did on Billy's panel? He did his presentation. He just put a video on, do you remember?
Yes! I was not expecting it. It was very...
Well, and I think that the thing is that we often have gotten asked if people can Skype in, and the thing about that is that we're in a hotel conference center, which means not enough Wi-Fi.
No, spotty at best.
Someone in. It's pretty spotty. We get kicked off too much, so we've not been able to have the opportunity to Skype people in, which in my opinion means we lose out on a lot of really amazing scholarship. So I know one of the things that we've talked about is how do we keep this community going outside of showing up in Boston in April. I hope people show up in Boston in April. Let me say that I hope we can show up in April.
Yes.
I am concerned that we're going to be in our houses for much longer than we think. But I think that this is teaching us, exactly like Melissa said, this is teaching us that we can do this in ways, and like we've known that, but we can't do that in that space. So how do we do an addendum? How do we do a halfway through the year vampire scholar check-in or whatever that is, so that we can have this vibrant community?
I agree. Maybe there's a way to do, I don't really want to suggest it to the wider group, but if we got 3 or 4, there's a way to have a virtual session where we all sit in the room and watch the virtual sessions.
Yeah.
I don't really want to make that
So
option.
I'm sorry, I have to go.
Okay.
But I look forward to hearing the recap of all this. It was very nice seeing all your faces.
Yeah.
So we'll be in touch. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Lisa.
Let's wind it up. Thanks. Bye, Lisa.
Bye.
So I guess I should thank you all for coming. And I see Dylan on her headphones. Hello. I guess I'll put the thread up on Facebook so we can add some stuff to it. And then next week we're going to work then on the 2 fiction interviews sessions, and then figure out a way to make it so that they can become interactive. So we'll put them up and then try and start a conversation. But if there's anything else you can think of that will help us keep the conversation going, that would be perfect. I actually like this image. I'm taking another shot.
Yeah, and just the dates is the only thing. And just when you have those.
Yes, we're meeting on Sunday. We'll figure it all out. Actually, if you have any things that you want to tell us, I know about the East and the West Coast. Anything else?
Yeah, we have 2 on the one. We have 1 on the East Coast. We've got 1 on the West Coast, and 1 in the middle. So we're kind of from all over.
We'll talk about it. Yeah.
And it's 3 guys and 2 women. So we've got a kind of a good balance. Karpov Kinred is a USA Today best-selling author. Myself, Greg Wilkie, is an international best-selling author and award-winning. And then I'm an international best-selling author. And then, of course, Dacre Stoker needs no real introduction, I don't think.
No, probably not. Maybe. I
really like the balance of men and women, and males and females. So I think that's going to be really good for us to talk about male vampire fiction too, because I tend to go for female authors, and that's interesting. And then, of course, Becky's being very quiet about it, but then we have Becky talking about her process and the metaphysics of the vampire novel, because I love her version of the vampire and her sexy fairies. So, so we'll have that. And also we have one other one, William Oram, who has his first novel. Actually, it's his second novel out now. Another professor who's written his second novel. So hopefully it'll inspire us all, and I'll finally get the novel out. If someone might contact you about the masters, the vampire masters, because I really wanted to do it. Now I don't feel like I do, but we'll see. So thank you so much, everybody, for playing along with us for 2 days in a row. And I really hope that we can help you, Hannah. If you need any more things for your PhD, or we can help you get published, then just let us know.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I read your collective work on Gender and the Vampire and Amanda's, and then saw like the call for papers for the conference and was like, oh my god, I want to go to that. There's a vampire conference. How cool is that? And then couldn't get funding. So I was really disappointed. And then when you posted this week on Facebook, I was like, this is amazing. Let me send an email. And so yeah, this is really, really great to be able to talk to other people in my field from across the ocean, and people whose work I'm familiar with as well. So it was really good. Thanks for including me.
You know, I think that that's really important as a reminder. One of the things that we try to do in the in-person conference is build some mentorship with our folks that are earlier in the field. So like reach out. You have a whole bunch of people that you've watched their faces and have met electronically. And like, I know that, you know, we took Billy under our capes. Is that what?
And I'm very appreciative of that. Very.
Kate says we don't bite. Like, definitely we try not to. Like, that's what we're here to do. Like, that's part of why I think we're all so passionate about this work, is that we struggled to get to sort of come out of the coffin about our work. And so what I know that Melissa and I have these conversations all the time. I know Kate and I have had them. Sure, many of you have had them with other people, but like, how do we help earlier in career folks be able to do this work in a more open, more engaged, really dig deeper, because we want the field to get stronger, and that's part of why we're here.
Absolutely. And also, one thing I like about us is we're not competitive. So your success is your success. It doesn't take away from my success. And I think that is definitely not true of the world of history or American studies, where everybody's competing with each other. So that's one of the things I feel like our job is to fix all the problems of the academy by doing it ourselves. That's the trick. So. All right, well, thank you very much, everybody. I will post this on Facebook if you're okay with that. Otherwise, yeah, this was a really great session. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you for organizing it.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
No one wants to hang up. I
I
understand.
know.
I know it's hard, but I will say bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, Kendra. It's nice to meet you.
Yep.
Bye. All right, really quick. Hi.
Hi.
Let me stop recording.
Oh, yeah.